Good afternoon, everyone, and let me make sure I'm the right distance here for the microphone. I'm a little bit vertically challenged and don't usually reach the microphone. My goal today is to kind of offer a theoretical framework for usage of the Apocrypha in studying Joseph Smith. And I find it kind of, in a general sense, a wild and woolly area. So I'm going to read most of my paper because I take a few shots, and so I want to be careful in the way I do those. Several approaches to interpreting Joseph Smith's use of the so-called Jewish and Christian apocryphal literature have been employed both by the critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and by those scholars professing faith in the Church and whose interests may be classified as apologetic. These approaches span the range of probative of Joseph Smith's restoration of lost texts in Scripture and dismissive of Mormonism generally because its sacred religious texts are founded on flagrant plagiarism of apocryphal literature. Before one can answer the most important historical question at hand, how Joseph Smith used the Apocrypha and what relationship that body of literature had to early Mormon writings, it seems prudent to first of all establish some controls on the discussion. This is necessary because previous discussions have largely contented themselves with drawing out parallels between apocryphal writings and early Mormon publications without any discussions of whether or not Joseph Smith had access to those texts under discussion, and I appreciate the care that's been shown today. Moreover, a wide variety of modern translations of ancient apocryphal texts are often employed when there is no possible way that someone living in the early 19th century could have known them. This is particularly important when citing phrases or passages that Joseph Smith might have incorporated into the language of the Revelations. An additional concern is that the context in which these events took place has had little bearing on the discussion, when in fact it is a significant issue. At issue is the way that Joseph and his contemporaries handled and approached extra-biblical texts. It is necessary to ascertain their willingness to use extra-biblical literature in the establishment of doctrine, in the shaping of their theological teachings, and whether or not extra-biblical literature had any normative value for faith and faith communities. From an examination of the available literature on the subject, it would appear that the presence of phrases, themes, concepts, teachings, and phraseology from the Apocrypha in Joseph Smith's writings have been viewed as extraordinary by both LDS scholars and those wishing to undermine the claims of Mormonism. For LDS scholars, the presence of parallels to intertestamental and Christian Apocrypha in early Mormon writings has been indicative that Joseph restored ancient doctrine and practice. For non-LDS scholars, the presence of parallels has been used to draw attention to the possibility that Joseph plagiarized available sources. Unfortunately, neither solution is probable. The larger reality is that the presence of such parallels may arise out of a much more mundane event. His family, or perhaps Joseph, was accustomed to reading a Bible in which the Apocrypha were included, and that the language of the Apocrypha is later echoed in Joseph's early writings. Moreover, this paper will demonstrate that, like many of his contemporaries, Joseph Smith was interested in apocryphal literature and its implications regarding the Christian biblical canon. I would also note that he seems to appreciate its potential to hold hidden truths. Joseph Smith and his family were not atypical Bible readers for New Englanders of their day. However, despite their interest in and family gatherings devoted to reading of the Bible, Lucy Mack Smith would later claim apologetically, quote, that Joseph had never read the Bible through in his life. At least some people close to Joseph saw him less a student of the Bible and more of a cultural Bible reader, but one who was given to meditation and study. Perhaps the most significant piece of evidence regarding Joseph Smith's knowledge of the Bible comes from his report of the visit of the angel Moroni, who quoted Malachi in a vision. Joseph was able to note differences between the printed KJV edition of Malachi and the way Moroni quoted the same passage. Some of these early reminiscences have obvious apologetic and explanatory interests, and one can readily appreciate the fact that Lucy Mack Smith's statement is partially interested in expelling the myth that her son Joseph was a careful student of the Bible during the time period of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Despite this apologetic interest, her summary is consistent with other accounts that Joseph was ponderous, but perhaps not engaged in long periods of focused reading. Joseph's account of the visit of Moroni, however, can be interpreted to mean that he was very conversant with biblical language. Even this conclusion, however, must be tempered because Joseph may have left out important details in the account, such as the fact that it required study in order to discover the differences. In addition to these statements, Joseph Smith Sr., in an interview once claimed that his son Joseph Jr. was, quote, illiterate, unquote, intending to convey the meaning that Joseph had no formal academic training. That Joseph Smith Jr. was illiterate has direct bearing on the question of whether he might have used the Apocrypha in shaping his Book of Mormon narrative. It speaks to his approach of using the Bible or biblical text, how he used books as academic sources, and what academic resources he might have used. Overall, the picture of Joseph studying texts, reading books, and using those sources to shape his narrative seems unlikely. The case is strengthened when an additional piece of evidence is brought to the discussion. When translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph frequently and extensively cited from the Old Testament and from language of the New Testament, and the New Testament language permeates the Book of Mormon. Rather than attempting to conceal, however, the Old Testament quotations in the Book of Mormon, Joseph quoted them in nearly verbatim language to the printed KJV at his disposal, and at the same time attributed them to their proper source when he knew it. 2 Nephi 11:2 confirms this. The process of translation of the Book of Mormon, as we've heard earlier, is described in a number of first-hand accounts, none of which mention the use of books that were consulted or other materials that were used in the translation process, apart from the plates that Joseph kept mostly covered. We can be confident that Joseph did not look things up in secondary sources, read through books, or consult notes as he carried out the actual translation process. Specifically, Emma Smith claimed that Joseph did not use manuscripts, probably meaning that he did not use loose sheets of paper or during the writing process. She said, quote, he had neither book nor manuscript that he read from. If he had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. Others who were involved in the translation also affirmed that no books were used or open during the translating process. However, it is possible that in the months between receiving the plates in September 1827 and February of 1828, Joseph may have studied and pondered the plates without actually translating the characters, and we've heard a paper on that today. During this time, it appears that he spent some time attempting to translate, but without any notable success. And again, we've heard some great information. This quote appeared earlier in Dick Bennett's presentation. He normalized the spelling. I've given it here as it appears. Joseph noted, quote, in the December following 1827, we moved to Susquehanna. The Lord had shown him, Martin Harris, that he must go to New York City with some of the characters, so we proceeded to copy some of them, and he took his journey to the eastern cities and to the learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he returned to me and gave to me to translate. And I said, I cannot, for I am not learned. But the Lord had prepared spectacles for to read the book before I commenced translating the characters. One way to understand this passage is to interpret it to mean that Joseph intended to say that he had not been able to translate the characters from the plates prior to the visit to Anthon Mitchell and others, an event which took place in the fall of 1828, 27, an event that is described here as visiting the learned in New York City. Important for this study is not whether Joseph had time to carry out research that may have included, among other things, reading the Bible and the Apocrypha prior to his beginning of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Although no sources indicate that Joseph was devoted to study during the months prior to the beginning of his translation, it is possible that some of his time was spent reading. It may be that he read the Apocrypha during this time, and I would emphasize maybe. This window of opportunity is important for this study because there are several words and phrases from the Apocrypha that appear in the Book of Mormon and nowhere else. The most significant piece of evidence in this regard is the appearance of the name Nephi in the Book of Mormon and 2 Maccabees 1:36. So it becomes what scholars call a hapax legomena, or a word that is uniquely used kind of in these sources. Because the name appears nowhere else in biblical literature and only in 2 Maccabees in the Book of Mormon, one can confidently surmise that Joseph had heard the name in 2 Maccabees. The unique name Nephi is alone sufficient evidence to suggest some type of literary borrowing. The vehicle, at this moment, I'm not going to mention how it happens. Additionally, some editions of the Apocrypha printed in the years 1820 to 1830 printed the name as Nephi rather than Nephi. However, the 1828 Finney Bible that Joseph Smith owned does print the name as Nephi in 2 Maccabees 136, and I can say that I've examined all three of the Bibles that Joseph had in his possession, and they all spell it Nephi. There are a number of other striking parallels as well, but again, they're in a big picture not formative of the Book of Mormon language. The most striking of those, apart from the appearance of the name Nephi, is the occurrence of the name Isaiah, which is again a unique reading between 1 Esdras 8:2 and Helaman 8:20. Other examples of shared language that's fairly significant is, quote, "For he was filled with wine," comes from Judith. He took hold of the hair of his head, Judith again, and also in Book of Mormon that appears as took by the hair of his head, and to make an abridgment, and you'll see that comes from 2 Maccabees again. These parallels bear strong overlap in language, but none of them arguably alters or informs the structure of the Book of Mormon. If parallels were formative for the structure of the Book of Mormon narrative, or if the parallels followed an identifiable linear development, then one could argue that Joseph Smith indeed borrowed the Apocrypha to build the Book of Mormon, and notice that they're almost all in 1 Nephi. Instead, these parables show that the language of Apocrypha crept up into Joseph Smith's wording and phraseology. To a much larger extent, the language of the Bible also informed Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon language. This is unsurprising given Joseph Smith's lack of formal education, and it is reasonable that the parallels that exist should be explained in the light of the fact that Joseph was most likely unaware of their source. Skipping forward, by 1841, the Saints had moved from New York City to New York to Ohio to Missouri and to Nauvoo, and had begun to openly embrace a traditional model of education. During a meeting of the Nauvoo Lyceum in 1841, John C. Bennett, a man of fame, was being introduced into the Lyceum audience. In that setting, Joseph Smith offered a physical description of John C. Bennett, a man who had recently been baptized into the faith and who had just arrived in Nauvoo, where he described Bennett in terms that are very reminiscent of a passage from the Acts of Paul. LDS scholars have long recognized the potential parallel and have commented upon the possibility that Joseph may have been aware of the description of Paul found in the Acts of Paul 1:1 and the public description given of Bennett. The public description of Bennett is recorded as follows, although Joseph attributes it to be a description of Paul. Quote, "He is about 5 foot high, very dark hair, dark complexion, dark skin, large Roman nose, sharp face, small black eyes, penetrating as eternity, round shoulders, a whining voice, except when elevated, and then it almost resembles the roaring of a lion." That has long been thought to describe the Apostle Paul. In another publication that I worked on previously, I argue that fits John C. Bennett's physical description to a T. In fact, there are no deviations between what John C. Bennett looked like and what's said right there. In fact, during his excommunication proceedings from a Masonic lodge, it says, quote, "John C. Bennett had a large Roman nose." So we really do have good confirmation that that's what Bennett looked like. Fortunately, the genetic relationship between the Acts of Paul and Joseph Smith's description of Bennett is clear and direct. We can state with certainty that Joseph Smith owned a copy of William Hone's influential The Apocryphal New Testament, where he would have had access to the Acts of Paul and its description. Specifically, he owned a copy of Hone's edition of the Apocrypha from the 1832 Ravenna, Ohio printing, and he later donated said copy to the Nauvoo Library. The Acts of Paul descriptions show several marked parallels to Joseph's description of John C. Bennett, but rather than quote the Acts of Paul directly, it once again appears that an ancient source shaped and molded Joseph's language, perhaps without Joseph even being aware of the source of the parallel. When compared side by side, the parallels suggest that Joseph was drawing upon memory to aid him in the description, and that the parallel was not overt or perhaps even intentional. Joseph Smith was attempting to flatter Bennett, the former quartermaster general of the state of Illinois, and he drew upon language from the Apocrypha. Further use of William Holmes, and I'll make quick work of this part, but we can confirm the usage of William Holmes' Apocryphal New Testament in several editorials by the saints. In 1842, in Times and Season, W. Phelps mentions the Infancy Gospel of James, which is only in English, available in English through the Apocryphal New Testament. There, he mistakenly connects the murder of Zacharias, son of Barachias, mentioned in Matthew 23:35, with the father of John the Baptist, who is also named Zacharias. The saying of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, as you remember, says the martyrs Abel and Zacharias, and only the Proto-Evangelium of James and early Mormon writings associate that with the father of John the Baptist, and so we can connect them fairly conclusively there. Also in 1842, in the Evening and Morning Star, as was mentioned in Jared Ludlow's paper, that Second Maccabees is quoted with the intent to confirm biblical accuracy. In doing so, the editorial states, quote, and I give this here, which is recorded in the second chapter of Second Maccabees, which the wisdom of man has seen fit to call Apocrypha. The statement is hardly a ringing endorsement of Apocrypha as a source of history, but at the same time, the reference also demonstrates rather uncritical usage of the Apocrypha, and as Jared mentioned, the further context there. In January 1833, the Morning Star again mentions the Apocrypha with additions to the book of Esther in the Apocrypha, wherein it states, quote, "Ancient men of the world put down as doubtful." Both editorials suggest that the saints were putting into practice a principle that would be revealed in March of 1833 as Doctrine and Covenants, section 91. I'm going to move to the book of Jasher here, which causes a lot of excitement for the saints, and try to ascertain Joseph's feelings through some of the things that are said by others. To help document whether or not Joseph Smith's perceptions and opinions toward the Apocrypha, it is important to consider Joseph's and others' reactions to the English publication of the book of Jasher, a book that has always been considered apocryphal both in content and origin. In June 1, 1840, the Times and Seasons ran an announcement publicizing an English printing of the apocryphal book of Jasher that it would eventually appear in print in August 1840. Like other 19th century Americans, the saints were quite excited by the publication of what was supposedly the lost book of Jasher. Key to the excitement surrounding the publication of Jasher is that it is mentioned twice in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 1 and Joshua 10. In the hype leading up to the publication, a rather public exchange in England between a publisher and scholar included claims of discovery and antiquity for the forthcoming edition of the book of Jasher. Interestingly, the debate was founded upon a relatively recent forgery of the book of Jasher by Jacob Elive, who printed a forged account for monetary gain and recognition. In 1828, a translation of the book of Jasher, based on the Moses Samuel edition of a medieval text of Jasher, was published in England. That publication, in part, helped end efforts by the English printer to republish the forgery. Despite the questionable basis of the Samuel translation, however, its publication was well received. So essentially, Samuel beats another publisher to the press and thus inhibits this forgery from going to print. It appears that a letter written by Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams to the saints in Missouri in June 25, 1833, an attempt was made to address some of the public concerns regarding the debate in England that early on. Their letter reads, quote, in part, "We have not found the book of Jasher, nor any of the other lost books mentioned in the Bible as yet, nor will we obtain them at present. Respecting the Apocrypha, the Lord said to us that there were many things in it which were true, and there were many things in it which were not true, and those who desire it should be given by the Spirit to know the true from the false." And you can clearly see the language of Doctrine and Covenants 91 here in this revelation, or in this letter. Because the letter corresponds roughly to the time of Samuel's translation appearing in print, and 7 years prior to the American publication of the book of Samuel Mordecai in 1840, suggests that the saints were interested in the discussion taking place in England and were hopeful that it would be a genuine edition of the book of Jasher. The letter takes a skeptical tone, but ironically, the copyright of the English edition, criticized in the letter, was later sold to an American printer and would eventually make its way to the saints. John Taylor, and not Joseph Smith, appears to have offered the most enthusiastic endorsement of the Mordecai Book of Jasher. In a Times and Seasons editorial entitled The Book of Jasher from June 1, 1840, John Taylor offered the following words of praise for the Mordecai edition. It is full of interest and written with a warmth of piety and sacred devotion worthy of taking an equal rank with any of the missing books not strictly canonical. Of course, Taylor had not read the book yet, but his pre-press excitement is obvious. Additionally, Taylor stated that it amplifies the events recorded in Scripture, although in a later editorial entitled Persecution of the Prophets, he did notice a discrepancy between Jasher and the Book of Abraham. I will note that Taylor does later go on to quote the Book of Jasher in General Conference in 1872. I want to make some concluding remarks and move to where I'm headed. We've already mentioned the instance of Joseph Smith placing the amended Bible into during the dedication of the Nauvoo Temple, and I want to mention another such source that comes from much later, expressed in Joseph commenting upon a family Bible. In visiting Edward Stevenson in Pontiac, Michigan in 1834, Joseph was visiting a small gathering of the saints. According to Stevenson's journal, the prophet looked over our large Bible and remarked that much of the Apocrypha was true, but it required the Spirit of God to select the truth out of those writings. He also looked over a large English Book of Martyrs, and I'm sorry I have this quote here for you. He also looked over a large English Book of Martyrs and expressed sympathy for them and later reported that he had asked through the Urim and Thummim regarding the lives of the martyrs mentioned in the book. My conclusions. The surviving evidence favors the idea and conclusion that Joseph Smith was influenced in direct ways from the Apocrypha. As a reader of the Bible, Joseph would have encountered the Apocrypha during personal or family reading of the Bible. Those early experiences are now rather difficult to trace, but the presence of several names in the Book of Mormon that have parallels only in the Apocrypha suggests that Joseph Smith had probably read those texts. Because those same apocryphal writings do not bear any direct influence on the narrative structure of the Book of Mormon, it is unlikely that the parallels between them are anything more than memories that surfaced in Joseph's thoughts during the translation process. He may not have been aware that the parallels between the books of the Apocrypha and the Book of Mormon existed. Reports of the translation confirm that no outside books were used or consulted. The process of translation relied upon Joseph and his abilities, and his training and early literary experiences almost certainly included moments where he read the Apocrypha. A similar occurrence is demonstrated in Joseph Smith's description of John C. Bennett, where there are evident parallels to the Acts of Paul, a Christian apocryphal source that was not part of the Bible, but a book that came into Joseph's possession in the 1830s. Again, the connection between the Acts of Paul and the description of Bennett seems to be memory. Joseph appears to have remembered structure and general outline, but he did not remember precise phrases or exact content. Later Latter-day Saint writers show a marked interest in the Apocrypha because they found it probative of Joseph Smith's teachings and revelations. They found proof texts for the doctrines of early Mormonism, and as a result, they began to trust the history of those sources and other matters as well. That growing relationship of trust in the Apocrypha as a source of history is also evident in several statements attributed to Joseph Smith, and it is a safe conclusion that Joseph Smith exhibited an open trust in the Apocrypha as genuine history in some instances. Thank you.